Often in this debate, we think radical honesty is about like being transparent with the other person in your relationship, right? Obviously, there are benefits to honesty, but we think what radical honesty differs from normal honesty is that like you're not holding back like half truth, you're opening up about all your feelings. And that we think that this is really beneficial as I'll prove later in my speech. So bit of framing before I begin. First of all, we think radical honesty, as shown in the info slide, is about sharing everything and like not holding back harsh truths and opening up about all your feelings. However, the way you share this does not have to be blunt or rude, right? We think that radical honesty is like saying, for example, I feel disappointed when our plans change at the last minute because I really value our time together, right? Instead of saying, like, you're a bad friend for like canceling our plans, right? And I think we think in this way, we're able to minimize the chance of feelings being hurt in the relationship, like thus ruining it. But instead we're able to help relationships be able to be built on like this level of honesty, which is like really crucial for that relationship to continue to like grow and solidify, right? And we think being it's about like being truthful while you like consider like timing, delivery, and context, right? So we think secondly, also like what does supporting like radical honesty look like? We think it looks like making honesty like the standard like norm in interactions. Like it does not mean that basic human etiquette is removed in all situations. For example, you still do need to consider how to express the like truth in a way that is mindful towards how the other person hears and processes it, right? But like you're still gonna be like making sure that we're just making sure that honesty is like a really like core principle that is ingrained in society, and we think that this obviously is really important, right? And I think like being radically honest doesn't always mean telling the person wait, no, sorry. Anyway, so we think that this is not contradictory because A, like the characterization defines radical honesty as like constructive, responsible, and respectful, and it's aimed at clarity, understanding, and self-awareness, not recklessness. We think secondly, like expressing feelings to a but yeah, anyway. So I have two pieces of substantive in this case today. First of all, how is this good for relationships? I think there are a few mechanisms. Firstly, how this is like a really trust building mechanism. So like when people consistently share their true thoughts and feelings, others really learn that they can rely on them, right? Transparency is like really helps reduce like suspicion and anxiety, which is fundamental in developing and develop relationships. Secondly, emotional clarity really reduces resentment. That's to say, like having radical honesty just ensures that like emotions are always expressed as they arise, which prevents like having hidden grudges, right? When you have bottled up feelings, it often leads to like just like resentment or passive aggressive behavior, which is obviously bad for the relationship. Thirdly, it just reduces misunderstanding because like when you do honestly share your opinions and expectations, it like really prevents assumptions and false interpretations. And lastly, like it just strengthens the connection in the relationship, right? Because having radical honesty, it encourages sharing your true feelings. It like deepens emotional bonds and connections. So why are these benefits exclusive to our side, right? I think normally, like it's fair to say, like in the beginning of a relationship, right? Especially like when you're less likely to be as honest, because there's a fear of like rejection or like this desire to impress and like uncertainty about like boundaries, as well as like a lack of established trust, right? I think when we have radical honesty and make sure that that's like establish that as a core principle in like societal situations, it means that like when it's encouraged, like it's going to be encouraged a lot as a value on our side. It means that the like period of deception or like withholding is able to be shortened in relationships, right? Like meaning that even early in relationships, trust is able to be built faster, and this therefore reduces misunderstandings and prevents like resentment from forming silently, right? Note that again, I like to re-emphasize our framing where like this like radical honesty is delivered in a really respectful way because like obviously we still have like societal values and emphasis on like being respectful to the other person, even if you are like sharing a harsh truth, right? And I think therefore it means that like in the long term there will be stronger relationships because it has been built on like really strong foundations in the first place, right? And this is something you cannot get with like ordinary honesty because when you're like really like comprehensive and like transparent that you get which you are when you're radically honest and you fully share your own needs and feelings rather than occasionally, conflict is able to be addressed early and like it really just filters out like really unstable relationships, so we just get better relationships, right? I think that was something that they were never able to get, right? Secondly, we think that this is good for the individual. For mechanisms, first of all, we think this reduces emotional burden. Like hiding your feelings from others, whether it's good or bad, takes a toll on yourself, right? Such as not opening up about a problem at school or about your own mental health, right? It can have a massive psychological burden on yourself. And we think sharing your feelings can help you feel understood and find help, right? Secondly, we think emotional intelligence, like it just like increases emotional intelligence, like because you're forcing yourself to really confront those feelings that you have and opinions, and it can help people understand themselves better and how to communicate with others better, right? And we think thirdly, it like strengthens authenticity. Like when you stay true to yourself and tell the truth as to what you want, you can live up like really based on your own morals and beliefs without having to conform to societal expectations. And lastly, we think it just like improves decision making, because when you make this, you can make decisions that are going to be fully aligned to your own beliefs now, right? Meaning that you aren't going to be pressured by others. So that was inherently good. What are the impacts of this? I think first of all, it's probably just going to be better for your mental health, because you just have that emotional relief. Like, you're not having all your feelings bottled up inside of you, and you're just able to express it to the other person, right? I think secondly, it reduces like internal tension again by allowing you to reveal like emotions fully. And I think that was something that's inherently good, because like, even if you have a bad emotion, like, you don't have to keep it bottled up inside of you. Think 30, it just allows people to reflect on their own feelings, needs, and values, which means that they're able to just like they're able to, because like radical honesty means like telling the other person everything. It means that you're able to like practice saying in a way that is nice, right? I think that means that you're able to like communicate better, right? It means that like your communication is just going to be stronger with the other person. I think fourthly, it just makes individuals just like more accountable for their actions. Like, it means that like, if you're saying something to the other person, it means that they're like you have to like take the consequences of it yourself. And this again really teaches that person to like make sure that the way they're expressing it is not in a way that is like extremely harmful or like degrading, right? And I think that that's important to help like people like express things that like might be a bit tricky, but in a way that is socially acceptable, right? And I think lastly, it just means it strengthens like resilience and confidence, because like you're able to like kind of own what you say, right? And you're more likely just to express everything you do. Sorry. Anyway, so I think that at the end of this, what it meant to have radical honesty in like and like support radical honesty, it meant that like radical honesty was probably going to be considered in all types of relationships, in like all types of conversations. It meant that the people in those relationships were probably going to like feel better and have a stronger relationship, because they were probably more open to each other, more honest. It meant like relationships that were just beginning to be developed or forming were probably going to be stronger then and there, because like the honesty was always a core principle in that relationship. I think at the end of this, it meant that like we just had better relationships, and the individual themselves would probably like feel better about themselves, because they're just more honest and they're able to share what they felt. So proud to propose.
My friend asks me if she looks fat in her outfit. No matter how fat I actually think she looks in that outfit, I will always have to respond with, no, you're gorgeous, because that is the emotionally intelligent thing to do, because that is the least damaging thing to do in order to preserve that relationship, in order to actually, like be a decent and respectful human being. I think the only thing that radical honesty does, and the only thing it achieves, is legitimizing disrespectful behavior in people, and like actively causing relationships to decrease in quality and decrease in like frequency. Okay, then, 4 things in my speech. Firstly, I'll do some points of setup on what radical honesty necessarily actually looks like, and then on where this radical honesty actually applies in the debate, i.e. whether delta is in this debate. Secondly, I'll do some responses, and then thirdly, I'll talk about why the quality of your relationships decreases, and then fourthly, I'll talk about why you have less relationships overall. Okay, then, firstly, quickly on setup, what does radical honesty necessarily look like? We mostly agree with side government in that it probably does look like sharing everything, but I would also note, additionally, it also probably looks like responding with absolute honesty when asked about your opinion. So, for example, me telling my friend that I think she looks fat, even though that's like incredibly rude. So uniquely, I think that means that information can be like forced out of you. That is, if someone asks you something, you must tell them what you think. You have to respond with absolute honesty. That is particularly harmful. Secondly, then, on framing, where does this necessarily apply? I think that humans are socially intelligent and like emotionally intelligent people. They care about their relationships. They're likely to be honest, and like communication is valued in status quo. They're likely to be honest anyway in instances in which they actually care. That means that the only instance in which this radical honesty is different from the actual status quo is in instances in which honesty is actually harmful, in instances where like you probably shouldn't say things like where white lies would be beneficial. That means that the framing here is particularly beneficial for opposition, because like people are unlikely to say hurt, people are unlikely to like withhold information anyway from people that they care about. Okay, then quickly some responses. The first thing they say is they disagree and with our characterization, and they're like, oh, you can sugarcoat people and you can sugarcoat truths and be mindful. You still express it in like a polite way. I think that applies to an extent. Like, you still can't hold anything back. This will probably going to be like rude in some sense, or that's probably going to be perceived as rude. The second thing to say is like, oh, it allows you to develop trust, build relationships, reduce resentment, etc., etc. Note that this is just not unique and that you can do that in status quo. I've gone through this in our framing. If I care about someone, I will actively seek to be honest to that person. People are emotionally intelligent, they care about their relationships. Secondly, I would also know that they ignore the very real circumstances in which telling the truth does fail, or telling the truth would be actively disadvantageous. I'll go through that in my speech. Okay, then, first point of substantive on why your relationships, the quality of your relationships decrease. Firstly, I would note that oftentimes it's just better to not say things like white lies, things like if you tell your parent like whether or not they have a favorite child, like obviously your mom's gonna say, oh no, I don't have a favorite child, instead of like selecting a sibling. I think that that's just like, sometimes it's just oftentimes better to like not to just lie and say a white lie that whose consequences won't be that, it's like not that deep. So that the only, in this instance, radical honesty just allows you to be disrespectful basically to people and to be rude to their faces. That's quite bad. Secondly, and more like impactfully, I think that you're forced to admit things prematurely before you're actually given the time to think through them. So what does that look like? I think that emotions change and are oftentimes short-lived. And if you're forced to express and therefore commit to them prematurely before you've actually thought them through, that can be quite harmful. So for example, if you're mad at your friend and you hate them at that period of time, if you then tell them, oh, I hate you, like I never want to talk to you again, they're likely to react in a really negative way. And then your relationship is just severed and like irreparably harms. Like when, if given time, you would probably think through that and just develop emotionally. I think that also applies in the inverse. Like you probably enter relationships that you don't necessarily want to be in just because you have like a crush, or you just have like a short-lived emotion that you're forced to express and then commit to. I think that is particularly harmful. This also doesn't just like apply to entering and leaving relationships. That also looks like things like admitting things that you're not personally comfortable with sharing with a person. So for example, if you live in a homophobic household and you're like homosexual, like admitting that to your parents, like, and getting disowned prematurely is probably not like, it's quite damaging for you. I think that in many instances, it's just much better for you to just hold it, like keep it to yourself, think it through, and express it to that person at a time that feels comfortable to you. So thirdly, then, and most like harmfully, I think that this leads relationships to become actively harmful and actively toxic. But before I move on, I'll take a PY. 3, 2, 1. Seeing as there are none, I will continue. So, like, I would note that relationships then become actively toxic. That is, firstly, relationships probably become more manipulative. That is, people now have information that is like deeply important, that is deeply personal to you, and are able to use that against you. Secondly, I would note that people are probably overburdened in that you overshare with your partner. You probably are overly reliant and overly dependent on each other. You probably don't rely on outside access points like therapy. That probably looks like you just being in an incredibly unhealthy relationship. That looks like more toxic relationships becoming more common, etc., etc. Okay, then second point of substantive on why you have less relationships. I have two main reasons for this. Firstly, I think you're just scared to enter one because it is a huge burden to have to share everything about yourself with a different person. Like if asked, that is hugely important for people. I would know this applies especially for avoidance or like introverted or withdrawn people in general. They probably talk even less with other people now because they're scared of the prospect of like having to share everything about yourself to a different person. That is like a huge burden and a huge commitment for someone to enter into. Secondly, I would probably have less casual relationships because like the point at which you're sharing everything about yourself with someone else, it's probably not a casual relationship anymore. Like that means that the reason why that's necessarily harmful is because I think it's just hugely emotionally draining and tiring for you to have to be like long-term and serious and like really committed to every single relationship that you're on. I think it just gets to a point where it's incredibly tiring. That means that people just choose to opt into relationships less. You have less relationships. You have more harmful relationships. Relationships degrade in quality. For these reasons, vote opposition. Thank you.
I think a few things to note here. First thing is just to say that like I just believe that being radically honest does not always mean like telling the person who hurt you. It means like safely expressing your true feelings to someone you trust, like a parent, a friend, or a mentor, right? I think that like, no, this is not contradictory because firstly, I like to note that like our characterization defines radical honesty as constructive, responsible, and respectful, and that like it's aimed at clarity, etc., not recklessness. But secondly, I'll just like to note that like expressing feelings to a trusted third party still achieves all the goals of radical honesty, right? Because I think it just means you're breaking mental mental oppression, you're gaining clarity and empowering like the individual. But thirdly, I'd just like to know that like after expressing it to another person, you can take your new insight and go discuss like carefully with your partner or like the person you have an issue with, and you can resolve that more better, right? Therefore, I'd just like to go into a few things on rebuttal. I think opposition gave you a few things here. First main substantive push was just basically on like why it's inherently bad for relationships, why it destroys relationships, and why like yeah, I think they gave you a few mechanisms here. First thing they told you was that like you're basically forced to prematurely admit things, you're forced to like enter into like harmful interactions that lead to like resentment, etc. I think I'll do a few things here. Firstly, I'd just like to note that like opposition is wrong, because I think radical honesty, as we define it, is like context aware and considerate, right? Just because you have to admit the truth all the time does not mean you can't like change the context or like how you deliver the truth or like the timing, right? As long as you admit the truth eventually. I think that like I'd just like to note, for example, I think it is not about insulting or hurting people unnecessarily. For example, I think in the do I look fat example, radical honesty would just look like focusing on constructive communication, like expressing like concern for health, etc., or feelings without delivering like a cruel literal truth, right? Therefore, I'd just like to say that like second response is just to say, even if you believe that is wrong, I think they're still false, because I think even if blunt honesty still sometimes causes tension, I think avoiding honesty creates hidden resentment, like passive aggression and like miscommunication, right? Because in the case, for example, if your friend has to ask you, does she look fat? That probably indicates some sort of like mental instability, and she's always like, it's not symmetrical. It's symmetrical in the case where both like sides create some sort of resentment, because obviously I think that like the friend is going to feel some sort of like uncertainty, right? Like in the way you responded, they're going to like take that not like badly, right? Therefore, I think that like especially in the case of toxic relationships, I think radical honesty just prevents these like long-term harms by encouraging clarity and mutual understanding. Therefore, I think thirdly, even if that's wrong, the comparative is still far better, right? Because I think even if some minor conflicts occur, relationships with radical honesty are obviously like going to be more authentic and resilient. But also, like fourthly, even if that's wrong, I'll just like to note in our new extension that I just think why we outweigh this, right? Therefore, second point they tried to bring up was why just like radical honesty reduced the number of relationships, because people were scared to enter new ones. They gave you a few mechanisms here. First thing they told you was like radical honesty is intimidating. People don't want to like overly commit to a relationship that would not have ended well. I think I'm going to do a few things here. Firstly, I'll just like to say that's false, because I think that like opposition is wrong, because I think as we define radical honesty, it does not require sharing every thought recklessly, like at the moment you think of it, right? Because I think people who practice radical honesty attract partners and friends who value transparency, trust, and authenticity. So it doesn't reduce relationships. It just like filters for ones that like are more compatible like for you, right? Because obviously I think that like people who practice radical honesty are more likely to enter relationships in people who also practice radical honesty, right? Therefore, also, second response is just to say that, like, even if that's false, and even if some people are initially hesitant, avoiding radical honesty just, like, leads to, like, entirely shallow or, like, fragile relationships where misunderstandings or, like, secrets and resentments build up, and, like, each partner continues to, like, doubt themselves and, like, doubt their, like, ability to commit, right? I think that, like, radical honesty just prevents these long-term issues, which are, like, far worse than like the initial hesitation. Then I'd like to move on to the substantive. Okay, so firstly, a few things here. Firstly, on characterization, radical honesty is constructive, it's responsible, etc. When you're being radically honest, you force yourself to address feelings that you might have tried to hide before, or like doubts you might have had, right? At its core, I think radical honesty forces you to express feelings or doubts you might have like otherwise like hidden. It requires a level of self-reflection and vulnerability. I think that means firstly you're more self-honest, secondly you're just able to grow as a person and choose what's best for you, right? Because that's contingent on knowing where you stand, which is what we're supporting, right? Therefore, I think in the context of abusive relationships, if you and your partner are both being radically honest with each other, then you simply are able to convey emotions and like thoughts you otherwise would have kept hidden, especially in the case of the victim, right? Therefore, secondly, why do we protect individuals in abusive relationships then? First mechanism, I think that like victims often do avoid expressing themselves to evade physical, emotional punishment. I think radical honesty encourages them to like acknowledge and like express feelings of hurt, like fear or discomfort, etc., right? Therefore, second mechanism, I think that like openly expressing feelings highlights the toxic dynamics in the relationship in the case of the abuser and the victim, right? By identifying these patterns, I just think that like the victim is better able to like think more clearly and like stop rationalizing or minimizing abuse. Therefore, I'll just like to note that like a bit of preemption, why does it just not lead to more abuse? I think a few things here. First thing, radical honesty starts with like self-reflection, right? I think that like even if the victim does not confront the abuser immediately, recognizing and like naming feelings internally breaks like mental oppression, right? And like it reduces psychological harms. I think by knowing what you truly feel, you gain agency and can plan like safer actions rather than like submitting to the abuser, right? But also secondly, I'll just like to note that like radical honesty does not like I think that like radical honesty just means victims can express feelings to like trusted friends, families, or professionals in the case where they recognize their feelings, right? I think this external honesty just allows for more support and strategic planning, which reduces abuse rather than increasing it. Therefore, what are the impacts of this? I think firstly, we're just able to like protect the vulnerable. We're able to promote self-awareness and empowerment. Just note that like I think if we're able to prove a marginal harm on this extension, I'd just like to note that we still outweigh opposition even at our worst case because the scale of the impact is therefore so proud to affirm.
Opposition identifies a key problem in the status quo. The people feel uncomfortable talking about their feelings. But the change in this debate isn't that people talk about their feelings more, it's they don't opt into relationships in the first place. Because the problem with their case was that it was all contingent on people opting into relationships in the first instance, but they never proved that that was actually something that was likely to occur. 3 questions. First, a bit of setup. Second of all, on the number of relationships. Third, on the quality of relationships. And then on abusive relationships. First, a couple of points of setup. The first thing I want to do then is characterize why are healthy relationships already likely to be somewhat honest. By the end of this characterization, you'll believe that the baseline is people opting into healthier relationships where they generally talk about their feelings, which is important because it believes that this norm pushes it too far. Because people are already likely to express their feelings to some extent, this legitimizes toxic and bad behavior. 3 reasons why. First, because it's frustrating for you to not be honest. Like, if your partner is doing something you don't like, that's probably pretty upsetting for you. If they're a really dirty person, if they're a person that doesn't show up on time, that probably makes you feel a little bit upset. You probably do want to say that. But second, we think that people generally want to be authentic. People don't really like acting as they characterize. And so generally, they are predisposed into being honest. Third, because people are selfish, they're therefore likely to underestimate how their partner will act. They're saying, oh, well, I was in the right when I was telling my partner when I was mad at her for not cooking dinner after I came back from my shift, because I'm a good person, I meant no harm, and therefore people are already predisposed into being quite honest with their partners. The conclusion then is this is a counteracting norm that pushes people too far. Because now it doesn't look like being kind and honest with your partner. It means saying your room looks messy. You are a messy person. You are a person that is being overwhelming and rude. I actively dislike you, which means that it is not actually so nice in the way that they want to characterize. The response here is that, well, you can probably just express it nicely. The problem is, if I tell my friend, you look fat in that dress, she is going to be offended, regardless how nicely I say it or not. It is inherent to the messages. But I would note, taking them at their best, the reason why people are likely to interpret these messages badly is because people are risk averse. Human beings are primed to recognize threats. Because when we evolved, if we did not recognize threat, then we got hurt and we died and we could not pass on our genes. Adjudicator, that's the reason why. If your friend ghosts you, you don't think, oh, they're probably busy. You start spiraling. You think, do they hate me? Do they not like me? Am I a person that is actively annoying? And that applies in their relationships as well. Because maybe your partner thought they were being, just an honest person expressing it nicely, but the way you internalize that is particularly harmful and therefore is likely to damage your relationship. That's the question of characterization. The second point of setup I want to do is explain what this debate is about. Because I want to note this is a supports motion. The opposition cannot fiat in and say, well, you're going to do it in a nice way. No, you have to explain what's likely to happen. And we think what's likely to happen is people will unfortunately express this in quite a rude and a blunt way. I think that wins the clash on the quality of relationships. Let's then move on to the clash on the number of relationships. And the reason I want to start with this is because it's the prerequisite to any of their impacts. Maybe it's true that the quality of relationships for most people goes up, but the people that didn't opt into relationships were the people that were the most mentally ill, that felt the most sad, that were the most in need of connection, that did not reach out to that case. And the reason this is important is because some degree of talking about your feelings is going to occur in any relationship. right? Even if it gets more on their side, there is some degree under our side as well. What changes on their side is they don't opt into that at all. Why is that? 4 reasons. First, because it becomes more overwhelming. If on the first date they start picking at apart every single one of your actions, they say, well, how much money do you earn? Why aren't you telling me? They say, well, why did you pick that specific kind of food? Why aren't you being honest with me? Then it's just overwhelming. And you think, to hell with it. I'm not going to go on any dates at all. But second, the relationships offend you and it makes you incredibly upset. If you ended a relationship with your partner storming out and giving you a list of 50 reasons of everything they hate about you, you probably don't want to go into a relationship again because people get mad. They express stuff. They are too honest. And that means you feel like relationships are harmful. You feel attacked at the very concept of having a relationship, and so you choose not to opt in. But third, as they characterize, people are generally uncomfortable about talking about their feelings. It's something that's very vulnerable, it's something that's very personal to us, and we think, I don't want to opt into a relationship, I don't want to talk about my feelings, that makes me feel uncomfortable. But fourth, because people's feelings are not set in stone. I don't know what I believe. For example, homosexual people, they're questioning their own identity, and they say, well, their father or mother says, well, are you homophobic, homosexual, or not? And that makes you feel incredibly upset, and you're more likely to opt out of a relationship entirely because you want to avoid any of that ambiguity that you have to express. The conclusion of that then is you just get less relationships overall, which overall decreases the enormous amounts of benefits that they tell you about positive relationships. You should weigh this on how it is logically prior. Lastly then, let's talk about the quality of relationships. And I want to start here by talking about abusive relationships. But before I do, I'll take a point. Okay,
If you say that people
Sorry, you.
POI, yeah. If you say that people are so risk adverse, then why do you think that they're going to be so rude and like try to be mean to other people when they're speaking the truth?
No, because it's risk averse. It's not that you're risk averse when you're saying the thing. It's you feel risk averse when you hear the thing, which is why oftentimes people make glib comments because they're not thinking about it. When you hear the glib comment, you feel really offended because you internalize that in a bad way. In fact, people underestimate how offensive they're being because they tend to be quite narcissistic, as is inherent to human nature. So let's talk about abusive relationships. I'm going to give you 3 reasons why this increases abusive relationships. First, because it forces you to reveal sensitive information. You can say to your wife, why aren't you telling me what you did at work? Why aren't you explaining why you're going out to your friends? Are there any guys that you're hanging out with? And you can say that all the time, and you can justify that with the narrative of radical honesty. You can say, it is your obligation as my partner to reveal this kind of information. And the problem with that then is it means people reveal too much information, and that is information that can be used against them. They can say, well, you're not talking to me about what you're doing with your friends, which means you then isolate yourself from your friends, and it makes you dependent on the abusive relationship. But second, it justifies toxic behavior and it normalizes it. Because if you're constantly saying, you look fat in that dress, why do you not cook dinner for me? Why aren't you working? It makes the person feel bad. It normalizes abusive behavior and means that is more likely to occur. But lastly, it increases blackmail because now you can get sensitive information from this person and threaten to reveal it to the public if they break up with you. Why is this comparative? Because you're able to recognize toxic behavior on our side of the house, but on their side, you normalize this toxic behavior as just radical honesty, just something that is already happening. And so relationships are far worse. They give you a bunch of responses here. The best one that they give is that, well, you won't talk to your friends as much. In fact, you talk to your friends far less on their side because now you're worried. You have to tell your partner, I was talking about you behind your back. You feel that expectation, and therefore you're less likely to talk to your friends in the first instance. Look, if someone tells you, like, you look fat, you're not going to say, oh, well, they probably meant the best. You're likely to stress about the quality of the relationship. You're likely to opt out of more relationships into the future. And if you're in an abusive relationship, it normalizes toxic behavior. Very proud to oppose.
So 2 things in this debate. First on relationships and second on like self. First on relationships, they had 2 main pushes that their case relied on. So I'll just like deconstruct these. First was on like the number of relationships would just decrease because of a massive burden of keeping each relationship alive. I had 3 things to say to this. First of all, we thought they just like we thought that like we flipped this. We thought that like you would get better friends, people and friends who didn't necessarily want to commit to the relationship wouldn't want to be friends with you. Therefore, you'd get better friends that actually wanted to be friends with you, that you genuinely felt safe with, and that just meant that like you could probably get better friends. But you had like and 3, we thought that you just like didn't waste any time. We thought that like under this like really radical honesty, we thought that you'd filter out any bad relationships, any toxic relationships. If you didn't necessarily want to stay with them, you could just leave them because you were telling the truth. The other person was telling the truth, and if you just didn't want to be friends, you could easily break it up and you just wouldn't be friends. And third, we thought you reduced like reduces like the pain in the long term because you don't hide your feelings. You're open about like whether or not you like spending time with them, whether or not you actually want to be friends with them. And that just meant that you could like reduce the number of bad relationships you have and like increase the number of good relationships you had. So we were unclear as to like why relationships decreasing specifically was so bad, and we thought that like you got better relationships and that was a plus. Second, they said that like the quality of relationships would just decrease because like you'd have such a massive burden and like people don't want to hear you say rude things about them. So just had like one main thing, which is like our characterization. We thought that we characterize this debate clearly as sharing truths respectfully and kindly. So I'll give you some examples of this. First of all, if you might say like to their thing about like parents saying that talking about their favorite child, they might like reframe the question. They might say, I love you all in different ways or something like that. We thought that like you were able to like reframe questions, you were able to like say things nicely, and it wasn't necessarily just like straight away, I only love like one child or something. Second, they also talked about how like this in like this very important stakeholder about like homosexual people in like a homophobic household. We thought that maybe first of all you could like test the waters by like introducing an example where you say like my friend is homosexual and see how they react to that, and if they're actually like extremely homophobic, you could probably like wait until you're like financially stable, or you could like dodge a question. Like in the worst case, we thought that that'd still be like okay, I'll take you later. And last of all, they talked about like how like there'd be like lots of blackmail and like toxic behavior in relationships because you know like the truth of other people. But we thought that actually wasn't going to happen because you were going to be in much better relationships. You're going to like trust these people much more, and we thought that like both people would like you could probably like take it like you could like do like you could deal with it legally, and you could like just talk to them and they'd be like honest with you. Yeah, I'll take that point.
Do you think there's a person on earth that believes that you're perfect 100%?
Well, I thought that the main reason why people wanted like relationships was because you could talk to the other person, you could try to improve yourself, and you could have someone that you could talk to. We thought that a relationship would be able to like try help both people out in the way, like such as people talking to each other about like their flaws and like trying to improve themselves. And we thought that was like a pretty good thing under our side because people could like get honest opinions from other people on how to like genuinely improve themselves instead of just like on upside where there's like a lot of honey-coated things with people just trying to like compliment you without really telling you like some like flaws that you might need to change. Okay, second on like this on this point of self. So we thought that we had like a lot of stuff on this, but like it wasn't really responded to. So I just like re-emphasize that. I just wanted to talk about how it's like extremely good for individual people because it reduced your emotional burden. It just meant that you could like instead of hiding your feelings from others, you were able to talk to others and like have separate opinions. As like the saying goes, it's like a problem shared is a problem halved or something like that. We thought that just meant like people's problems were able to get like more easily opened up. For example, someone with depression may be able to talk to like their family or talk to their friends if they ask, is there anything wrong? Are you okay? We thought that was pretty good because that meant that they could like have more open discussions about like their mental health and about like their any problems that they might have at school. We thought that was pretty important and like that meant that people wouldn't close up to other people as much. And we also just thought like so that was good for mental health, and that was also good for like internal tension, and it also meant that like you could live your life fully because you like fully made decisions based on what you believed yourself, and we thought that was incredibly good. So I'm proud to
1. 3 things I'll deal with in this speech. Firstly, I'll talk about the framing of the norms and how they're likely to exist. Secondly, I'll deal with individuals. And lastly, I'll deal with relationships. Firstly, in terms of the framing of norms, how do we think this norm is likely to manifest? Opposition has a pretty consistent characterization, which is that it is likely to be friendly, context-aware, concise, etc. Why do we think that even if this is the intention, and even if it plays out in some cases, why do we think, as we explain along the bench, this is not likely to be the most pervasive or most common case? Firstly, even if you say things in a way that is particularly context aware or in a way that is particularly gentle, the meaning remains the same. So as we explained to you from second, that looks like, for example, saying, I think you're a really mean person, as in comparison to saying, I think you could work on your behavioral temperament. Either way, the meaning is there. It is likely to make people react in particularly bad ways. And therefore, that might be the point at which you're better off just not saying anything if this conflict wasn't going to be something that caused particular harm to you. Obviously, however, if it did cause you a lot of harm, I think reasonably you are likely to express it anyway. And the reason for that is that people are often averse to things like pain and averse to things like discomfort. If a relationship was actively causing you discomfort and you had the ability to express your opinions on it, you probably would, just because you were a human, that was something you wanted to do. So as we explained to you then, the difference is the instances in which this was going to be used particularly badly, and the difference was when relationships just ceased to exist or dipped in amount because you were scared of the commitment that you had to layer on. But secondly, I think, and notably, I think that your inability to respond immediately means confirmation, and this responds to the stuff that we get at third, which is for example, maybe if you're a homosexual, you can reasonably test out the waters. Maybe you don't have to tell your parents right away. But I think eventually the kind of thing that happens is that your parents are going to ask you, why don't you have a girlfriend yet? Are you actually heterosexual? And your response might be, I'm sorry, I can't really tell you, which is fair enough. But then the immediate assumption that comes from your parents is oh, this means that they must be homosexual, because they know that you are avoiding their question and therefore putting in a truth that you don't necessarily want to say. Obviously, this is just one example. Kind of framing and the premise remains the same, which is that in the instance in which you're not ready to express your opinion, or in the instance in which you were simply uncomfortable, your lack of response was likely to create even deeper understanding in a case in which honesty was so radically normalized within society that just not saying anything is worse than in the counterfactual that we support, which is just where it's more normalized to be oh, okay, maybe they're not ready to talk about it quite just yet. What does this mean? Firstly, it just means that their norm, even if they put it out with best intentions, and even if their best intentions happen sometimes, are just likely to be quite averse and lead to bad impacts. Okay, firstly then on individuals, I think they have 3 claims. Their first claim is that you can earn personal resilience and authenticity. 2 responses. Firstly, I would know that there are just alternatives to self-discovery that don't necessarily entail heaving a huge commitment of your personal feelings onto someone else. So that looks like, for instance, going to clubs or checking out mental health books or just reading things that maybe relate to you strongly. But secondly, I would flip this and provide a counterclaim that we give you at first, which is that emotions can be massively volatile. And therefore, as we explained to you from first, you are likely to just have to commit to them straight away because they are the emotions that you have to express to someone. Under our side, we uniquely allow individuals to have the ability to self-rationalize and to self-reflect before they have to express these emotions. Therefore, you're able to preserve relationships, but you're also able to make the individual feel more comfortable. And I think that was massively important just on the benefits of the individual, on how comfortable they feel entering into relationships, or just their own personal resilience and sense of authenticity that they build up from it. The second claim is that it reduces personal emotional burden by expressing them to others. Firstly, I would flip this. So in reasonable cases, you're probably forced to say things before you're ready. And this was our counterclaim, which is about stuff like homosexuality or just things about yourself that you're just not ready to express. But secondly, I would know that you're just unlikely to confess in the first place, because as we explained to you, to little to no response, emotions are a commitment, both for the side that has those emotions and for the party that has to receive that emotion. You are less likely to want to, force the burden of your emotions onto someone else, because maybe it is just deeply uncomfortable revealing to someone how you truly feel. I think even in, for example, therapy sessions, there are probably things that the patient actively holds back because they feel uncomfortable saying it straight away. You're less likely to tell people about your personal emotions when you don't have the ability to control how these emotions come out, because you bought into the normal radical honesty where everything must be said. So I would also just weigh this on personal comfort and personal happiness and explain that it was extremely good, and people had, and on our side, people were able to get into the space and into the comfortable zone where they could eventually, after some self-discovery and some self self-rationalization, express themselves instead of needing to force it all onto a third person party because they couldn't reasonably discuss it with the person who those emotions were aimed towards. But thirdly, the claim is that they can improve themselves by hearing this feedback. Firstly, it is unclear why this is likely to happen because people are likely to react in particularly irrational and emotional ways to hearing negative feedback. So for instance, if my friend tells me, Serena, I think that you have anger issues and I still love you, but I just think you have anger issues, I'm not going to be like, oh, let's like go over every reason why I have anger issues and let's self-rationalize this. I'm probably going to be a little bit annoyed and a little bit upset at her for saying something like that. But secondly, I think in their best case, it is still symmetric. You're still able to reasonably earn feedback that you could, improve from. Like, for example, like debating feedback, like no adjudicator is going to tell you, oh, I thought your speech was completely terrible for your age and actually not good, but you could still receive reasonable feedback that meant that you were able to improve in a really good and really exponential way. Okay, secondly then on relationships, their first claim is that it can highlight toxic behaviors and therefore reduce abuse. Firstly, I'd flip this and explain that as we tell you from second, this is likely to create more toxic behaviors. And the reason for that is the reason why people are likely to stay in abuse generally isn't because of how they feel about it. It is because of things like power imbalances, institutional failures, a complete like dependency on your partner. That means that they are unable to leave situations of abuse. So in the worst case, it is probably likely to be symmetric on either side of the house, but notably that this is likely to happen more under their side. And this is where the difference occurs. And it's also a counterclaim because you are forced to reveal information and the relationship is more likely to spiral in particularly toxic ways when you have to reveal things that you don't want to. And even if you choose to stay silent, as I explained in my first issue about how this norm is likely to manifest, it just means that the person is going to make their own assumptions instead of reasonably giving you time to adjust and to talk about this. You ought to weigh this really highly on vulnerability and on scale, because even if you believe that only one more abusive relationship was created out of their counterfactual, that was still something that you ought to give to us because abusive relationships were massively harmful. Their final claim is to say that there is more honesty in relationships. Firstly, I would flip this and explain that there is probably less because honesty becomes a commitment that not everyone is necessarily ready or able to buy into. But secondly, honesty is not always good, so maybe telling white lies sometimes is just helpful. But thirdly, as we explained, and as is our counterclaim that is less rebutted, there is just a lack of relationships. And for all of those reasons, very proud to oppose.
Four things in this speech. Firstly, on the quality of relationships. Secondly, on abuse. Thirdly, on the number of relationships. And then fourthly, on the individual. Firstly, then, on the quality of relationships, our government's main push is just that relationships get better. You develop trust, you reduce resentment, and you reduce miscommunication. But I think we've sufficiently dealt with that down the bench by saying things like, firstly, our framing, in which we present that people probably tell the truth anyway, because they invest in relationships and they care about relationships anyway. We tell you reasons at second, like structural reasons at second why this is true. That means that it is likely that the only instance in which radical honesty really applies uniquely is instances in which you probably wouldn't be the best to tell the truth, or in instances in which you wouldn't have told the truth in status quo. The second thing I'll tell you under here is that the second thing that we tell you under here is that we mitigate this by saying that okay, sorry, never mind. That means that this claim is if not completely dealt with, I think that it is mitigated to a degree in which it would be outweighed by the rest of our content, just because of the fact that it's not mutually exclusive. You could have a healthy relationship anyway. You can be honest in a relationship anyway. So then, next, I'll talk about what do radical relationships necessarily look like, and therefore, what are the impacts of radical relationships necessarily look like in terms of harming or mending relationships. The first thing they tell you is radical honesty is context aware and is polite, and you can be polite about it. What do we respond to this? We tell you at second that firstly, people are honest anyway, and then that secondly, this norm likely pushes it too far, and that you're likely to be rude and blunt. But even if that were not true, we then tell you down the bench that it gets to a point you cannot be the meaning is still conveyed in your words. So if my friend asks me if she looks fat in a dress, and then I start expressing concerns about her health, obviously that's still offensive. Obviously people are able to read the meaning behind what I mean. People just can tell. Secondly, then on abusive relationships, firstly, we provide you a bunch of material on why manipulation is likely to happen, because people have access to deeply personal information and they're able to use that in bad ways. Their only push on abuse was just that it allows you to uncover your feelings. We give you a bunch of reasons as to why that's not true. Firstly, because you're likely to be controlled so that you're able to talk less with the people around you. like outside of your relationship. That is what SCEGGS talked about, like what SCEGGS said about like not being able to interact with the friends. Secondly, I would note, as stated by third, like you still can't leave that relationship even if you realize that it is unhealthy, just because of the power imbalance, just because you're scared of your abuser, etc., etc. Like even if you tell your abuser, or you tell your parents, or you tell the people around you, oh, I'm scared of this person, like I don't want to be in a relationship with them, it's not going to change anything. I think that abusive relationships still happen. We then give you active material on why abuse is likely to happen more on our side. I think it's pretty clear why we win that theme. Thirdly, then, on the number of relationships, we tell you like a bunch of material about how it's incredibly overwhelming to now enter into new relationships, because you have to like overshare basically and tell them everything about you. The only like response that they really give is that like, oh, you have more genuine relationships, albeit you have less of them. I still think it's quite harmful, because like imagine you have two people, like two friends, and then they know everything about you, and like you have no other friends. I think that's still incredibly harmful, because it still causes over dependence. It's still like severely restricts your ability to connect with other people, and as such we still win on that. Then finally, on the individual, only thing under here that I really had was like mental health. And they talk about why like you develop mentally as a person. Three things. Firstly, I think that again, oversharing is incredibly overwhelming, so people are just unlikely to opt into that. Secondly, I think that we're able to share in status quo in a better way, because they're actually able to like think through their opinions and think through their feelings and then share them. That's better than just being forced to like say what they have on their mind. And then thirdly, again, I think codependency is just incredibly bad. If you and your partner are just trauma dumping on each other all the time, I still think that's quite unhealthy. I think that's actively worse for your mental health. For those reasons, we win all of the four. We win the above clashes, and therefore the debate. Thank you.
2, 1. So we think that like when you have radical honesty, right, it means you're going to get like less relationships with the people that don't practice radical honesty, right? And I think that this is a good thing, because like I think if a person practices radical honesty, they probably also value honesty themselves, right? Like which just doesn't apply to people who don't practice radical honesty. Therefore, I think that you do get more relationships just with people who practice radical honesty, which like overall leads to like better relationships as well, because you are with people who share the same morals and values as you, right? So I think that like what we mean by like supporting radical honesty is it means that like you probably also has that flow-on effect of societal emphasis on social etiquette and respect, right? Why is this true? I think radical honesty, it requires mindful communication, right? When you're thinking about how to be truthful without being necessarily hurtful, especially like when you're delivering things like harsh truths, right? This means that it's like if you have radical honesty as a societal norm, people will probably be more aware of their tone, like their timing and delivery, right? I think this naturally encourages like better social etiquette and respect in conversations, right? I think secondly, radical honesty just it involves not only sharing your thoughts, but also actively listening to others in a way that validates their like feelings and opinions. So for honesty to be radical, both parties must be willing to listen and understand each other's perspectives. I think this inherently in itself fosters empathy and respect. So I think that it was probably like true that if we were to support radical honesty, it just meant that there was that flow-on effect of having a more increased societal awareness on like social etiquette and respect, and delivering things that are like in a kind of way, right? So I think that like side opposition has three main pushes in this debate. First of all, they tell us that like people just won't opt into like relationships. Why do we think that this is false? I think first of all, like when we have like radical honesty as a societal norm, that means people will probably value authenticity more, right? And that means that like it just allows you to engage in like relationships with other people who are also supporting the same values as you. That is like radical honesty. So even if honesty does feel uncomfortable sometimes, right? People would probably value having trust and intimacy and problem solving, which radical honesty just has, right? So I think people will probably not just be scared away if someone else is radically honest with them, because they probably are radically honest themselves, right? I think secondly, supporting radical honesty means like recognizing it as a core value in relationships. That's to say that people who opt into relationships, again, understand that transparency and direct communication are expected. It is a shared expectation that both people like maintain, right? So they're probably prepared for honesty, even if it is a bit uncomfortable, right? So I think just because like they enter the relationship and they and the others being like really like honest with them, it doesn't like mean that they'll necessarily be scared away and never enter into other relationships again. Secondly, they tell us that like toxic relationships will happen and like with radical honesty. Why is this false? I think first of all, like I think avoiding to say things just like And they also tell us that, for example, sometimes it's better to like not say things. I think firstly, I think avoiding saying things just leads to opportunities for harmful seeds to grow, right? For example, if I answer you like if I answer you're beautiful to my friend after she asked me, the idea of her asking in the first place probably meant that she was doubtful, and my response would only worsen that doubt. I think overall it leads to overall more dishonesty and doubtful commitment in relationships. I think secondly, when they tell us that like emotions change and therefore we shouldn't share emotions because they change so much, I think that sharing changing emotions really helps partners to like respond appropriately by resolving the issue instead of it like escalating, right? For example, like in the example they give at first off, when they tell us that you're having a fight with your friend, I think it'll be far more beneficial if you actually shared your feelings when it arose, as this prevents like the build-up of resentment. For example, if you like kept it in, the small frustration will probably grow over time. It meant that like the eventual confrontation was probably much more intense, much more hurtful, and much more difficult to resolve, right? If you were to say then and there, you're just like say to your friend that you're being really hurtful right now, it would probably allow both like parties to consider what went wrong, etc., and like allows both to like confront their own feelings, their own and other feelings, right? And I think that this makes it more likely for discussion compared to if the frustration was left to like fester, right? And the last thing it tells is that there's a lot of personal discomfort, and I just like to say that discomfort forces I think discomfort may be good in our situation because it just forces the individual to confront really difficult emotions, right? Things like hurt feelings, frustrations, or insecurities. I think it's also an opportunity for self-reflection and emotional growth. And when you're radically honest, we just think that short-term discomfort is for a long-term benefit, right? And I also like to say that when they say that like you can get it in their world, I think we're able to get it better in our world just because like if for some people who are like entering like relationships at the start, they probably are less likely to be honest. I think that was something that didn't exist in our world. So proud to propose.